Scott here with another episode of the History Unplugged podcast. If you grew up in the United States and were asked, what is the great American novel? For most, your answer would be F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby. Many Americans read it in their high school literature classes, and even if they didn't have to read it under compulsion, they may be one of the 500,000 people who purchase the book annually, which adds to the over 25 million copies that have been sold worldwide. The book has been made into 3 movies and produced for theater. What most people don't know is that much of the story of The Great Gatsby is autobiographical. When F. Scott Fitzgerald sat down to write the book in 1924, he suffered much of the same heartbreak, infidelity, struggle, alcoholism, financial hardship, and ultimately trying to reinvent himself even when it was impossible. Today's guest is William Hazelgrove, author of the book Writing Gatsby, the real story of the writing of the greatest American novel. We look at how, by this time in Fitzgerald's life, he descended into an alcoholic run of parties on Great Neck, New York, where he and his wife Zelda lived. The book was a massive flop when it was released, and it only became a success after Fitzgerald's death when the U.S. military selected the book and sent it overseas during World War II as part of its Armed Services Edition. So in this episode, we talk all about the relationship between the artist and his art, and what an artist goes through to produce great art. We enjoyed this discussion with William Hazelgrove. Before talking about F. Scott Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby, let's talk about another author who's temperamentally and stylistically very different, and that's Hunter S. Thompson. Thompson claimed that he did something that's always stuck out to me as a writer. He said that he wanted to know what it felt like to write a great novel, so he sat down and retyped word for word The Great Gatsby, and he claimed that he also did this with A Farewell to Arms. Maybe somebody would do this to develop the muscle memory of good writing, the way a martial arts student does a form to know what it feels like to do punches and kicks. Whether the story is true or not, what do you think that Thompson saw in The Great Gatsby that would make him do something like that?
You know, when you think about The Great Gatsby, you also think about the 3 movies that were made. The first one is lost to history because it was on that silver nitrate that probably blew up at some point or spontaneously combusted. And then you look at the 74 film with Robert Redford, and then the Baz Luhrmann film of 2013. And while I think the 2013 film came the closest, it's almost impossible to film this novel and have it not become clunky. You know, when Gatsby delivers the line, "Can't repeat the past, all sport." Of course you can. Well, you know, in the novel, it's perfect. It works so well in every part of it thematically. But in the movie, it sounds this clunky line that's delivered. And part of that is because Fitzgerald's writing in The Great Gatsby is so elegant, so elevated, and so packed up with connotations that it's almost impossible to duplicate on the screen and not have it come off sounding hackneyed and a little clunky. But I think what, Hunter S. Thompson, let's assume he did this, was trying to drive at was that, well, how do you write something that is 50,000 words and it ends up standing for all time the American dream? And it's on the surface a very simple story. So what's in those sentences that have so much power? And when that prose, Fitzgerald's prose is so elegant. And how would you do that? So I think you're right. When you said at the beginning, maybe somebody would take it on and saying, well, if I can recreate a Rembrandt, maybe when I go to write my own great American novel, which actually, as we discussed before, Hunter S. Thompson, I can't really believe that was his aspirations, the father of gonzo journalism and just, lost in the Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, but it shows, and it's really fascinating, he said he did it with A Farewell to Arms too, that for his time, these were the 2, bars to hit. And so, maybe he would sit down with a carton of cigarettes and a bunch of whiskey, bourbon, and sit down and pound away and pound it out. It's certainly you could spend your time doing worse things.
He's a good writer, but also, firing in all sorts of different directions. I'm talking about Thompson here, and him being so disciplined and training himself to write and then chasing around Nixon after dropping LSD. It's like somebody who spends 10 years studying Kung Fu and then moves to Scotland to become a hooligan and stab a police horse. But let's not talk about Thompson anymore because the man of the hour is Fitzgerald. What your book does is focus not so much on The Great Gatsby itself, but on the life of Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda as well. More specifically, the time that he spent on the French Riviera in 1924, where he goes along with their daughter so that he can write his third novel. Tell me about his career up until that point. He's well established and famous. So what had happened with Fitzgerald's career up to 1924?
Writers had a great advantage at that time. They could write for what was called the Slicks, which was the Saturday Evening Post magazine and other magazines of that ilk. And these were very well paid magazines in terms of, Fitzgerald's high point was getting $4,000 for a story, which is probably like $30,000 today. It's unbelievable the kind of money he made for short stories. Now, saying that, he didn't like them. They've been collected, the good ones today, and they're brilliant, but he hated pounding out these stories because he always wanted to work on his novels. So up to this point, he and Zelda have become, the emblem of youth in America. She is a flapper. They are having these incredible parties in Long Island, which will be mirrored in Gatsby. We can talk about that. But he's having trouble getting work done. And also because he's constantly in debt, he always has to go back and write for the Saturday Evening Post. So he's not being able to block out any time to write this elusive third novel. We had This Side of Paradise was a great success. The Beautiful and Damned, the second novel, did pretty well. And yet he could not get going on this third. So what he does is he squirrels away some money and he gives himself some time. And he says, I've got to get out of Long Island because, these parties just won't stop. People are seeking out their home. And so they decide to go to the French Riviera in the summer of 24 to essentially start over, give himself time, get the distance he needs from the crazy, hectic party life that he and Zelda had basically been living since 1920. And, we say party now, we think of a night. They would go for a week, of just nonstop drinking, partying, going from one party to another. Part of that was the 20s. He became famous at a time when America really had no youth culture. And they became the youth culture. And, it's really fascinating to think about that because we are so immersed in the youth culture. Well, all you have to do is watch an old movie and realize there was none because everybody dressed like 40-year-old adults, even kids. But this culture, this urban culture produced this moment where they became the face of it. And from 1920 on, they just lived a party. And so the plan was to leave and do this novel.
What your book does is parallel the events of the summer with events in the book, showing that much of it is autobiographical. Let's take a look at that, and then you could recap events in the book for those who either are far removed from their American Lit classes in high school or perhaps have not even read it, with things that actually happened. So let's talk about in the book where Gatsby has the affair with Daisy. What happens in the book and how does that parallel events of the summer?
Well, so Fitzgerald's writing, and they develop a routine where Zelda takes their young daughter, Scottie, but they also have a woman to watch her. And then Zelda would go and, go to the beach, go hang out with the Murphys, which was a rich expatriate couple. But, Zelda was a person who needed to be entertained. And Scott worried about this a lot because she would get sort of out of hand, even in New York. And so while he's writing, she's left to her own devices. Well, one of her own devices is she bumps into a man named Edward Jozan, who is a, handsome French Italian, actually, aviator. And they start to, drink together, go to the beach together. And ostensibly it looks platonic, but it quickly becomes an affair. And this is in the middle of Scott Fitzgerald's novel that he's writing, The Great Gatsby. And you can almost see on the timeline of the novel where this intersects. And so this starts to inform the affair that Daisy has with Gatsby. And this is really, Fitzgerald had to have almost an example for his writing. And his biggest example was always Zelda. You go back to This Side of Paradise, you go to The Beautiful and the Damned, you go to many of his short stories. That's Zelda as the heroine. Just over and over and over he used her. He created the flapper as we know it. And that was Zelda. So, He really had this living character who he was living with, and he needed it. He needed to know what would happen. And so what I started to realize as I was researching, writing this, was that, oh my God, he really was using her to sort of observe what would happen, even to the point where he introduced her to Edward Josin. And when he started to realize that something was going on, he used that. He used that in the book. So getting back to your original point, what starts to happen with Gatsby, what I started to realize is that every part of Gatsby, which is really the American dream personified, is F. Scott Fitzgerald's life. It is, I'm sure we'll go through it, but every part you can draw a diagram right to something in Fitzgerald's life.
Let's unpack some more of those things too. The character of Tom Buchanan and his brutality, who does that mirror in Fitzgerald's circle?
It's very interesting. When he was in Long Island, there was a polo player, a wealthy polo player, and his first name was Tommy. His last name escapes me now. But he, there's a great line in the novel where he says, Tom was wealthy enough to bring down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest, Illinois. It's hard to believe a man of my generation would be wealthy enough to do that. Well, that's exactly what this Tommy, I think his name was Tommy Burbank. Tommy did. He had his own string of polo ponies. Now, the brutality of Tom is sort of an amalgam of Americans that Fitzgerald had bumped into. And also there was this brutality about him that is the underside of the American dream of striving to have, the golden girl, to have this life of wealth and opulence, that to do this, there is this brutality involved. And so Tom Buchanan becomes sort of an amalgam of this Tommy character who Fitzgerald bumped into in Long Island, and then also sort of a catch-all for this darker side of the American dream and the men who ruthlessly really end up on top.
How so? Could you describe more of that, of what you see in this amalgamation that reflects these people that he comes across?
Yeah, Tom, he's a man who's inherited wealth. Fitzgerald was always the poor boy looking into the keyhole at the rich. And that came from basically growing up on Summit Hill in Minnesota. And his own father lost his job when Fitzgerald was probably 12 and never went back to work. Edward Fitzgerald was a Southern gentleman and really probably felt work was below him. So it came to his mother, who was McQuillan, whose father was a wholesale grocer, very successful. And so it was her inheritance that they lived off of. F. Scott Fitzgerald never lived in a home he bought. His entire life, he lived in rented homes, including his childhood. But he lived on Summit Hill, and because his mother had this money, it wasn't a lot of money, but it's just enough, he was able to play with the rich children. And so he would be invited to all the parties. He went away to prep school, St. Regis. And of course, then he would go to Princeton, which we can talk about was a disaster. But he was always the poor boy. So now one of the themes of Gatsby is poor boys shouldn't try and date rich girls, right? And this was actually said to Fitzgerald in Lake Forest at a party of Geneva King, who actually is another heroine of his who was sort of a stand-in for a lot of his characters. And so he was always the poor boy, which is circling around here to Gatsby. Gatsby is from Minnesota. We find out at the end of the novel. Gatsby comes from just these dirt poor farmers. But he recreates himself and he becomes Gatsby, this other person. That's a very American theme, by the way, that in this country, not different from Europe, we can move about in the class system. We are not confined to being working class. We can move up if we like, and we can reinvent ourselves any way we want. And this is exactly what Gatsby does. Remember, there's that great line in The Great Gatsby where he says he's the platonic conception of himself, in which, if anything, means he's the son of God. So what Fitzgerald believes and lives is that you can recreate yourself. And Fitzgerald always fantasized, too, about having fabulously rich parents. there's a story called Absolution where he has this fantasy, he's Blanchford Semington. In it, he's sort of the son of a king. And Fitzgerald basically discounted his own father as a loser, not maybe in those brutal terms, but and his mother was eccentric and he was sort of ashamed of her, the way she dressed and things. So this is very much mirrors into it. So Tom Buchanan plays into this, is emblematic of this rich, these people who, and of course, Buchanan says famously, more in the movie it's brought out than in the novel, but he says famously to Gatsby, at a point in the confrontation over Daisy, he says, we're different from you. I am, Daisy is, you may have the money, but you're not like us. You'll never be like us. So he sort of knocks down this whole idea that you can move about in this American capitalist system and says, no, not really. Really, you're stuck. Even though you have the money, you're nothing. You're just a bootlegger.
This raises an interesting point that we can see paralleled in lots of other historical figures. And the question is, when you have a writer who is telling a story and there are autobiographical elements, is the writer subconsciously inserting those things, or is the writer so self-aware that he is seeing himself and taking parts of his life out and putting it into the story? And by way of analogy, with William Shakespeare, there are many things we don't know about his life. And a lot of literary scholars in the 18th and 19th century assumed that the themes in his plays were simply autobiographical. So even though they didn't know that he may have had troubled romances in his young life or tried to have a relationship with a woman who was from a rival group, they thought, well, that's in Romeo and Juliet. So of course it happened to him, because why else would he write about it? You could even make an argument that in the scholarship of Islam, there's almost no biographical information about Muhammad in the Quran. It's simply non-existent. What is said about him comes from the hadith, or the oral collections about his life. And some argue in literary analysis of these that the hadith collections, if they weren't actually a transmission back to his life, they were taking themes in the Quran, like caring for the orphans, and imputing it back into his life. That, well, of course, Muhammad was an orphan because he cared for orphans. So let's reverse engineer what his life was based on this. So some people just assume that the way that we could recreate somebody is by taking the themes that they draw. And it raises an interesting question of, are they aware of imputing these themes into their writings or not? And it simply happens incidentally. What's your take on it, having looked at his life and looking at the themes in The Great Gatsby? Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsors.
I think Fitzgerald is very literal, actually, in terms of taking the events of his life and transmuting them into art, which the word transmuting is the key word here, because the ability to take events of your life and then flip them on their head and let them go through that really mysterious device that creates outstanding fiction is something very rare. Because, what Fitzgerald did with The Great Gatsby is he did a compendium of his life. Actually, his other novels would mirror parts of his life. This Side of Paradise was him growing up, all the way up to Princeton. Beautiful and the Damned was he and Zelda in New York, period. Well, now he gets this overview. And I think going to the Riviera really allowed him to do this and see America from afar and see what he was trying to see, because he really was trying to grab this new American dream that had evolved in the 20th century. He had come from the Midwest. He had gone east to find fame and fortune. Same with Gatsby. He did want the Golden Girl. He did lose the Golden Girl. He lost Zelda when she said she would marry him because he had no money. He had nothing. And so then he goes to New York, publishes, against all odds, This Side of Paradise. And first novels traditionally just don't do anything. And this thing takes off and sells 50,000 copies. And he goes back and he gets Zelda. So he goes back to the well and says, can't repeat the past. Of course you can, all sport. So this becomes part of his theme, and it becomes Gatsby's theme, is that you can recreate the past. And so he takes that to its logical conclusion. And, what we find tragically, of course, is you really can at the end of the novel, but also in a bigger sense, his entire striving for this fame and fortune that he found and the golden girl that he found also had this darker side to it. That, in fact, it might all just be a canard. It might just be this mirage that people run after to find. It dissolves. Gatsby has that great line, or rather, Fitzgerald has that great line in the end. After Gatsby's shot, Fitzgerald said, "Did he look up and see what a horrible thing a rose is in the sunlight, really?" Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that when he lost Daisy and he realized she was never coming back, he lost the illusion of life, the grand illusion that gives life so much meaning and color. And the dream died on him. So then we go all the way to that final line. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past, which is just a brilliant line in American literature. But what does it really mean? Well, what it means for America is that we were founded, this of all people, in this huge continent that allowed us to incubate and create this democracy of small towns founded around church and little eco centers. And these were little incubators of democracy. And this also gave us footing and stability. Well, when this was lost in the 20th century and the urban culture came in and more people moved off farms and more people lived in cities and farms, we were adrift. There's nothing to moor to anymore. And so, that line is, of course, so we be on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. So here we are always trying for this elusive green light, if you will, the green light at the end of Daisy's dock, which is so symbolic in the novel. Yet we're always pulled back to these small towns that in fact are just behind us. So our happiness is actually behind us, even though we are, it goes, and so we beat on, one fine day, we find, boats against current, borne back ceaselessly to the past. So we're always reaching forward, but in fact, we've missed something that's already behind us.
All right. So he was aware that he was taking parts of his life. And to Fitzgerald's credit, he actually had an interesting life. So making something autobiographical wasn't a bore for readers, as opposed to the glut of books written by literary people about the central character being a professor at a leafy New England college and the troubles when he has an affair with an attractive graduate student. It's like, yes, we need more of those books because they're so riveting.
Yes. Exactly. And, this was a very, at its bones, it's just this tale of this bootlegger, right? And an affair and a murder, really. And so in a way, it's a very tawdry tale. And, I'm sure we'll talk about this, but when the book came out, that was one of the things the reviewers went after. They said the book was trivial, that it had, the subject matter was not dignified, not worthy really of Fitzgerald, that in fact it was just this, silly little tale. And also the length of the book, 50,000 words, very short, very small for its time. And we're kind of used to shorter books now. They were not then. When you bought a book then, you bought a big book, and the bigger the better. And, Fitzgerald's book was teeny. And so this was another thing that, when looking at it, people thought, well, when we talk about this, why didn't it do better? Well, it was short and the tale was tawdry.
Well, one, tawdry element that is also important and reflected in the 1924 summer on the French Riviera is in the book, Myrtle Wilson being locked over the gas station garage and her death, and then what happens with Zelda during that summer. Can you talk about the fictional event and then the real event which inspired it?
Yeah, and this is very pivotal to the novel, and you can almost go through it and see where Fitzgerald veered. Okay, so Zelda has her affair, and, in Zelda's defense, she'd become an appendage. She'd become this living character, Fitzgerald. She had no real function in life other than being this party girl. Fitzgerald had his writing. Writers always have their writing, period. That great line out of Player where the writer confronts the movie executive and says, "I'm a writer. What are you?" So Fitzgerald always had. Well, anyway, so Zelda finally, finds this man who she perceives loves her for her. And that, she's not his muse. She's none of that. And she wants out. So she goes back to the villa and Fitzgerald's writing. And she says, "I want a divorce. I want a divorce. I'm having this affair and I don't want to be married to you anymore. And Fitzgerald is just aghast because not only is this his wife, it's also his living character. And he says, no, you can't have a divorce. In fact, I want to confront Joseanne here, which will play into the confrontation at the Plaza Hotel between Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, Daisy and Nick Carraway there. And so what does Fitzgerald do? Fitzgerald says, no, you aren't going to divorce. In fact, you aren't going to even leave. And he literally locks her in a room in the bedroom of the villa to keep her from leaving him for Joseanne. Now, saying this, we know now, Joseanne was never going to come for Zelda. To him, it was a fling. He was a young guy moving up in his career, this aviator, and he did not see this as long-term. And this is where Zelda really erred. She saw much more into this affair than he did. And she saw it as, they could get married. And he did not see that at all. So he never does come for her, ever. Yet, Fitzgerald uses this and creates the confrontation of two things he uses it for. One is Tom has the tawdry woman, Myrtle, who lives over a garage where he goes famously to, stop and get gas. And there's the Valley of Ashes. And the eyes of Dr. T.J. Ecclesburg look down, which are the eyes of God. And so Myrtle's husband suspects an affair and locks her in the garage, above in the garage, and says, I've discovered something and we're leaving. And I'm going to keep her up there until we leave because I think something's going on. Well, he's figured out she's having an affair. And so what you have is, that's directly transposed to what Fitzgerald did. He locked his wife up so she couldn't leave him. And then, not to tip the hat too much here, but then Zelda, Fitzgerald used to take a sedative called Dial, D-I-A-L, sleeping pill. And Zelda would take them occasionally too. Well, he goes in there and into the block bedroom. He finds her passed out in the empty Dial bottle and realizes she owes deed. He then drives to the Gerald and Sarah Murphy's residence to get help, to help him. And they drive back frantically, get Zelda up and get her walking around and make her puke and all this other stuff. But it was clearly a suicide attempt. And then what do we have happen to Myrtle in The Great Gatsby? Well, she runs out in front of Gatsby's car and is hit and killed by Daisy, ostensibly, who's driving. But, again, this intersection of this possible death of Zelda, this destruction of her over the affair, and the destruction of Myrtle as well. These two things intersect again. This really veers the novel and also, again, creates the big confrontation at the Plaza Hotel.
Well, tell me about the book's release, its failure, and then during this wilderness period for the book, this is also when Fitzgerald's story comes to an end. Can you talk about this time period?
Yeah. So what happens is Fitzgerald pinned everything to this book. It was supposed to be a critical success for him. It was going to elevate him as the man of letters. And, and he had a great reputation up to now anyway. And also financially, it was going to bail him out. He saw great things for that. He wouldn't have to write for the Saturday Evening Post anymore. It would change his life. Well, the book comes out and immediately he gets a telegram from Max Perkins. It says, reviews excellent, sales doubtful. Well, right away, Perkins says this. And then it turns out the reviews weren't so excellent. In fact, they were very mixed. A lot of people went after Fitzgerald. Just brutal reviews. But again, a lot of reasons, a lot of people, even good friends of his who reviewed it, said that the tale was trivial, that the story of Gatsby was trivial. The writing was elegant, but the story was trivial. And the length of the book was very short. And a lot of people didn't know what to make of it. And also, Max Perkins figured this out very early. He said Fitzgerald had written over the head of his readers, and he had. He'd come up with this style where 50,000 words stood in for 100,000 words. The sentences were so packed up, meant so much more, that readers just didn't get it at this time in 1925. So what happens? Well, Great Gatsby essentially disappears. By Christmas, you couldn't find a copy in a bookstore, maybe a few, but this is at a time when, of course, there's no online selling of books or anything. If once you were out of the bookstores, you were out. And Fitzgerald's novel just disappeared. And Fitzgerald had to go back to writing the slicks. Zelda, unfortunately, starts to have a breakdown. She ends up having schizophrenia. She has to be institutionalized, where she will remain the rest of her life in the 30s. Fitzgerald has tremendous financial debt. He goes to Hollywood. He's a drunk. He's an alcoholic, and he gets fired from one film from another. And, of course, this brings up the famous scene where he goes looking for his own books in 1940 and can't find them in any bookstores, and people don't even know who he is. And then he dies from a heart attack. In his OBs, his obituaries, he's written off. He's written off as this guy who had all this talent, but, lost it in alcoholism and frittered away all his talent. And they don't even mention The Great Gatsby a lot of times. So he's this literary footnote. All right. World War II breaks out. And they decide to have a program called Armed Services Edition. And ASEs are just books that are printed on this very cheap paper, double-sided, and shipped over to all the GIs who are sitting in foxholes, and they want to give these guys something to do between, killing people. And one of them is The Great Gatsby. So about 250,000 copies go overseas of this little, and the summary on the ASE is this tale of a Long Island bootlegger, right? Well, these guys read it, and they come back, and they become teachers, professors, work in libraries, all sorts of different professions. And they tell other people about this little story called The Great Gatsby, and also about this guy, F. Scott Fitzgerald, who seems like he's a pretty good writer. And this starts Gatsby to percolate through, again, American society. And then in the 50s, Malcolm Cowley has sort of compendium edition of Fitzgerald's work come out, and the Fitzgerald Renaissance begins, where Gatsby starts to filter up as this story of the American dream. And it just grows and grows and grows until today, we're at 50 million copies sold and 500,000 sell per year.
Scott here. One more break for a word from our sponsors. I'd really like to analyze this process of Gatsby becoming part of the American canon, which it indisputably is. It may be considered, if you ask people the great American novel, that's probably what people would say if they just have to spit something out in a few seconds. But when we think of what makes something enter the canon, we would like to think it's a carefully curated process in which there are all these literary types around there reading every single book that comes out and, awarding it literary points. And the books with the highest literary points percolate up to the top. And then finally in this process, the greatest of the great books are then taught in university courses, of which those students who become English teachers teach it to their high school students. And the canon goes, and the literary tradition of Western civilization continues to march forward. But this sounds a lot more like an accident, where somebody wrote a book, he clearly had a vision for it, clearly someone of incredible talent, but for whatever reason, it wasn't the right time or place, it's forgotten, and then by a stroke of dumb luck, for whatever reason, this is chosen by the U.S. military to send to GIs. And I could very easily have seen GIs who are, stuck at the Battle of the Bulge, freezing and shivering, and they're thinking, reading this book about these dandies partying in the 1920s and forgetting it and using it for toilet paper, but they don't. It strikes a chord with them. It really seems to deeply resonate with them. And those GIs who go back to America, who get educated at universities, then transmit this book forward. So can you walk through how this thing enters the American canon and how much of it is a deliberate process versus dumb luck?
Yeah, I think, first of all, the very accessibility of Fitzgerald has stood him well. You read Hemingway and, okay, I like Farewell to Arms and all that, and early Hemingway is fantastic, but it's strangely dated. It's his minimalistic style. It's a little encoded. Fitzgerald wrote in a very accessible style, and The Great Gatsby is a very simple story. So when you're reading it, at the heart of it is this guy who, wants his girl. Well, anyway, so the GI's reading it, it's an easy read, and they can get, sucked into it. So in a strange turnabout, And, the way the books moved among the GIs is one GI would tell another, hey, this is pretty good. You should, here's this ASE. And the books were designed to be passed around. I think they figured out it could be passed around 6 or 8 times and they would fall apart. They were that flimsy. And so this book, this little short story really was passed around for all these guys. And I think that it had a sort of dual prong, because on the literary side of the world, Edmund Wilson's, the Malcolm Cowleys, who were sort of the literary grandfathers by this time, they knew Fitzgerald very well. I mean, Wilson went to school with him and they understood his work, how good he was. But I think time allowed this book, so you have this sort of accidental discovery by GI. So it's moving up through the general populace at a time when these other sort of literary men are saying, he really didn't get a fair shake. And this is actually pretty good. And his work, now seen from a distance, really is standing out. And so I think he got a double push. I think he got a push from this very populist movement of people reading his work. And, at this time, The Great Gatsby was pretty contemporary. I mean, I think, my daughter just read it for her class and she was like, eh. And, and I said, well, let's watch the movie. And she liked the movie a little better. So, for this time, maybe it seems like not a big deal story to the current generation or something like that. But at this time, it still had resonance. It still had some tawdriness and some real resonance to just normal people who were reading this story. So I think it was moving up as a book that was catching on. And then on the literary side, the critics finally got off of he wasted his talent. Fitzgerald was always compared to an old woman who had a diamond and didn't know what to do with it. And that was the way they viewed his talent. Great talent, but he squandered it. I think they finally got off that and realized he didn't squander his talent. He actually wrote some really good books. And by the way, his short stories are amazing that he wrote for the Saturday Evening Post, the ones that have been collected, Last of the Bells or Winter Dreams or The Ice Palace. These are brilliant stories that stand the test of time. And so they started pushing him on that side. And this is also at a time when Hemingway was the undisputed king, but Hemingway had retreated to Cuba. He hadn't written anything for 10 years, any fiction. He was busy, fishing and drinking and writing stories for Arnold Gingrich and his Esquire on fishing. So there was this sort of vacuum almost for a little bit. And, then of course The Old Man and the Sea came out, but that was sort of a different dated story when it came out. And so there was this sort of opening in the 50s. And what's really interesting too is because Jack Kerouac and the Beats were coming up too. And then as Fitzgerald's coming on. So go figure out American literature. But Fitzgerald is great reading. And that's really what I think happened. I think it just started to catch on with the public. And then I think these guys who knew Fitzgerald, who knew he'd gotten a short shrift in terms of, his legacy, started to push him from the critical side. And then suddenly people said, hey, he's a really good writer. In fact, he's a great writer. And in fact, The Great Gatsby is the great American novel that sums up the American dream.
Well, this story is inspirational for writers who release a book that sells very poorly on its release, which with the state of the publishing industry today, that's sadly most books. But beyond that, looking at Fitzgerald's story and how it's paralleled in Gatsby, what message do you hope readers take away from your book about the relationship between art and the artist?
The artist goes through hell a lot of times to produce his art and not knowing what's going to come out at the end. And, when Fitzgerald died in 1940, there was 2 stacks of The Great Gatsby in the Scribner warehouse. And it wasn't that it was out of print, just there was no demand at all. And Fitzgerald got a $5 royalty check the year he died for all his books. So here's this great American writer who basically died in obscurity, broke, yet he is one of our greatest American writers today, regarded as our greatest, and of course his books sell. So, I think what people should take away from it is that there is the artist, and, Ernest Hemingway had a great quote where he said, the most diseased oyster, the best pearl. And I think that's very true with a lot of artists, that they do go through hell to create their art. And it's a work of faith. And so, for a writer today who produces a novel and it doesn't go anywhere, Fitzgerald knew. He knew he'd written something great. He knew it in his bones. And did he know that it would come back the way it did? Probably not. But I think he knew that it would find its way because it was good. And it did. And to the point where today, 50 million copies later, it is just regarded, and I would have to say it's regarded more than Hemingway as the final, statement on the American dream.
Well, this adds a lot of nuance to a story that many people have come across, whether through high school literature classes or their own reading, and gives us a better sense of how consciously writers can take elements of their life, put it into a story. And your book, In the Spirit of Fitzgerald, is also very readable. I enjoyed it. And for listeners who want to check it out, the name of it is Writing Gatsby, the real story of the writing of the greatest American novel. William, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.